The twin suns of Kepler 442b blazed overhead as Park Jin-woo wiped sweat from his forehead, staring at the broken atmospheric processor that had finally given up after months of jury-rigged repairs. The massive machine sat silent in his ranch yard, its crystalline core cracked beyond his skills to fix. Without it, his terraforming operation would collapse within days, and with it, his last hope of making something of his life on this dusty frontier world. His hands shook as he counted, the credit chips in his worn leather pouch. Barely enough for basic supplies, let alone the specialized parts he needed. The other human colonists had already written him off as another failure, another dreamer who thought he could make it on the outer rim without corporate backing. They whispered behind his back about the ranch that never quite worked. The man, who talked to his broken machines like they were old friends. The rumble of spacecraft engines drew his attention skyward. 3 sleek Zephyrian consortium vessels descended through the orange-tinted atmosphere, their hulls gleaming with an oily black sheen that reminded Jin-woo of insects. He knew what this meant. Market day had arrived in the settlement of New Pyongyang, and with it, the monthly auction that most colonists pretended not to know about. Jin-woo had sworn he would never set foot in that place. The very idea made his stomach turn, but as he looked at his dying ranch, at the withered crops and the silent machines, desperation clawed at his chest. He needed workers, and legitimate labor contracts were beyond his means. The consortium had made sure of that when they flooded the sector with cheap slave labor, driving wages so low that only the mega-corporations could afford proper employees. The auction house squatted like a metallic tumor on the edge of town, its walls lined with energy barriers that hummed with barely contained power. Jin-woo kept his head down as he approached, his farmer's clothes marking him as an outsider among the wealthy alien traders and corporate representatives. The air reeked of ozone and something else, something organic and unpleasant that made his nose wrinkle. Inside, the main hall buzzed with activity. Tall mantis-like Zephyrians clicked and chittered in their musical language, while shorter, bulbous Graxian merchants examined holographic displays showing productivity statistics. Robot sentries floated overhead, their scanner beams sweeping the crowd for signs of trouble. At the center of it all stood the auction platform, where a massive insectoid auctioneer gestured with 4 arms while its translator collar converted its speech into a dozen languages. The first lots were alien, criminals and debtors, beings Jin-woo couldn't even identify. He watched in growing horror as families were separated, as proud warriors were reduced to property values and productivity ratings. His hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. He was here for a reason, even if that reason made him hate himself. Then came the human section, and Jin-woo's heart nearly stopped. 24 children stood in a ragged line, their ages ranging from perhaps 8 to 16 standard years. They wore simple grey uniforms marked with identification numbers, their faces bearing the hollow look of those who had seen too much too young. Some stared at the floor, others gazed defiantly at their captors, but all carried themselves with a peculiar dignity that struck Jin-woo as purely human. The auctioneer's mandibles clicked rapidly as it began its pitch. Premium mammalian stock from the Titan mining operations, excellent dexterity, surprising problem-solving capabilities, and remarkable durability for their size, ideal for precision work, maintenance tasks, and hazardous environment operations. Jin-woo felt sick. These weren't products being sold. They were children stolen from their families and forced into labor that would break most adults. Yet he found himself studying their faces, looking for something he couldn't quite name. His own daughter would have been about their age now, if she had survived Earth's fall to the consortium 15 years ago. Lot 17, the auctioneer announced, gesturing toward a small girl near the center of the line. Female, 12 standard. Years experienced in mineral extraction and equipment maintenance, demonstrated resistance to toxic atmospheres and radiation exposure. Opening bid 50 credits. The girl raised her head, and Jin-woo's breath caught in his throat. Despite the dirt streaking her face and the exhaustion evident in her posture, her eyes burned with an inner fire that reminded him painfully of his lost daughter. Her name tag read Kim Sora in faded letters, and something about the way she stood, shoulders straight despite everything, spoke of a spirit that refused to be broken. Around him, alien voices called out bids with casual indifference. 50. Credits 60, 70. They discussed her like livestock, debating her potential lifespan and work capacity. But Jinwoo saw something else in her gaze when their eyes met across the crowded hall. Intelligence, yes, but more than that. Hope. A desperate, fragile hope that someone somewhere might see her as more than just another piece of property. His hand moved to his credit pouch almost without conscious thought. The hover truck's engines whined as Jinwoo guided it through the rocky canyons, leading back to his ranch. The precious cargo sitting silently beside him. Kim Sora hadn't spoken a word during the entire journey from New Pyongyang, her small hands clutched tightly in her lap as she stared out at the alien landscape rolling past. The purchase contract crinkled in Jinwoo's shirt pocket, a reminder of what he had just done and the credits he could never get back. His ranch house sat like a lonely island in the middle of the terraformed valley, surrounded by fields that should have been green with earth crops, but instead showed patches of sickly yellow where the soil processes had failed. The main house was modest but sturdy, built from local stone and recycled starship hull plating that gleamed dully in the afternoon light. Behind it, the massive atmospheric processor loomed like a dying giant, its crystalline core flickering weakly through transparent panels. Sora climbed down from the truck with careful movements, her eyes taking in everything with the quick, darting glances of someone who had learned to assess threats and opportunities in seconds. Most of the other human colonists would have immediately pointed her toward the worker barracks behind the equipment sheds, but Jinwoo surprised himself by opening the front door of his house instead. "You must be hungry," he said simply, leading her into the small kitchen, where he kept his few remaining supplies. Sora's eyes widened as he opened cans of real protein paste and reconstituted vegetables, food that cost more than most slaves saw in a month. She ate slowly at first, as if expecting the meal to be snatched away, then with growing eagerness as she realized no punishment was coming. The spare bedroom had been empty since Jinwoo's wife left 3 years ago, unable to handle the isolation and constant failures of frontier life. He found clean sheets in the storage unit and made up the bed while Sora watched from the doorway, confusion evident on her dirt-streaked face. "The worker quarters are more comfortable," she said quietly, the first words she had spoken since leaving the auction house. "I don't need special treatment." Jinwoo paused in his sheet folding and looked at her. "This isn't special treatment, this is just being human." That first night, he heard her crying softly through the thin walls, but by morning she was up before dawn, standing in his kitchen with her hair neatly braided and her borrowed clothes clean. She helped him prepare breakfast without being asked, her movements efficient and practiced in a way that spoke of years of forced labor. The big machine. "Outside," she said as they ate. "It's dying." Jinwoo nearly choked on his coffee. "What makes you say that?" "The harmonics are wrong, I can hear it even through the walls." She tilted her head, listening to something he couldn't detect. "The crystalline matrix is fracturing, maybe 2 days before complete failure." He stared at her. The atmospheric processor was indeed failing, but it had taken him weeks of diagnostic scans to determine that. How could a 12-year-old girl diagnose the problem just by listening? Over the following days, Sora proved herself to be far more than he had expected. She absorbed information like a sponge, asking questions about terraforming theory that would have challenged university students. When he showed her the basic maintenance routines for the smaller machines, she grasped them instantly and began suggesting improvements that made his head spin. But it was when the processor finally died that her true abilities revealed themselves. The failure happened during the night cycle, when the processor should have been running its deep-cycle atmospheric scrubbing routine. Instead, Jinwoo woke to alarms blaring and the acrid smell of sulfur compounds seeping through his air recycler. Without the processor, the natural atmosphere of Kepler 442b would poison the entire colony within hours. He found Sora already outside, standing before the massive machine, with her small hands pressed against its hull plating. Her eyes were closed, and she seemed to be listening to something only she could hear. "The primary flow regulator is completely burned out," she said without opening her eyes. "But look here." She moved to a different section of the machine, pointing to what looked like a minor access panel. This secondary system was never activated. The original engineers left it as a backup, but the control pathways were never connected. Jinwoo pulled up the technical schematics on his portable display, scrolling through pages of incomprehensible alien engineering. Sora, this is incredibly complex. Even if you're right, the modifications would require specialized tools and components I don't have. She opened her eyes and smiled for the first time since he had bought her. Uncle Jinwoo, what if we don't use their way? What if we use the human way? For the next 6 hours he watched in amazement as Sora crawled through access tunnels barely wide enough for her small frame, rewiring systems with salvaged parts from broken farming equipment. She bypassed entire sections of the original design, creating elegant solutions that somehow made more sense than the overcomplicated alien engineering. When she finally emerged, covered in coolant fluid and grinning with pride, the processor hummed to life with a sound unlike anything Jinwoo had ever heard. The air immediately began to clear, but more than that, his diagnostic system showed efficiency readings 30% higher than the machine's original specifications. How did you know this would work? He asked, staring at the impossible readings. Sora wiped her hands on a rag, suddenly looking very young again. I don't know, I just saw how it wanted to work instead of how they made it work. That night, as Jinwoo watched the stars through his now clear atmospheric dome, he began to understand something that chilled and excited him in equal measure. The aliens who had enslaved humanity saw them as weak, as simple creatures suitable only for manual labor. But what if they were wrong? What if humanity's greatest strength wasn't physical power or advanced technology, but something far more dangerous? The ability to see solutions where others saw only problems. The morning started like any other on Jinwoo's ranch. Sora was in the workshop, her small hands deep inside the guts of a broken irrigation robot, humming an old Korean folk song her grandmother had taught her before the consortium took her. The past 3 weeks had transformed both of them. Jinwoo's ranch was running better than it ever had, and Sora had blossomed from a frightened slave into something that amazed him daily. The peace shattered when his proximity alarms screamed across the valley. 3 sleek Zephyrian Enforcer ships descended from the orange sky like black daggers, their hulls bristling with weapon arrays and scanner dishes. These weren't the clumsy cargo haulers from the auction house. These were military vessels built for intimidation and violence. Their engines howled as they settled into landing formation around his property, kicking up clouds of red dust that obscured the horizon. Jinwoo's blood ran cold as he recognized the lead ship's marking. The Crimson Mandible Strike Force, led by Vrex the Ripper, a scarred veteran who had crushed 12 human rebellions across the Outer Rim colonies. Stories said he collected the skulls of resistance leaders and kept them mounted in his command center as trophies. The ship's boarding ramps descended with hydraulic hisses and outmarched 24 heavily armed Zephyrian soldiers. Their exoskeletons gleamed with military-grade armor plating, and their weapons hummed with barely contained energy. Each stood nearly 3 meters tall on their powerful hind legs, their insectoid heads swiveling as they scanned for threats. Vrex himself was a nightmare-made flesh. Ancient battle scars crisscrossed his chitinous hide, and his left mandible had been replaced with a cybernetic implant that sparked with electrical discharge. One of his forearms ended in a plasma cannon where his hand should have been, a reminder of some long-ago battle that had cost him dearly. Park Jinwoo. Vrex's translator collar converted his clicking speech into mechanical human words. You have violated Consortium Code 7.4.2 regarding proper livestock maintenance protocols. Surrender the property for immediate recalibration. Jinwoo stepped forward, his legs trembling but his voice steady. Her name is Sora and she's not property. She's a child. Vrex's compound eyes focused on him with predatory intensity. Emotional attachment to livestock is a documented human weakness. The specimen has clearly been contaminated by excessive comfort. Our medical teams will correct this deficiency. Behind the lead enforcer, Jinwoo could see specialized containment, equipment being unloaded from the ships, neural restraint collars, memory modification devices, and worse things that made his stomach turn. They weren't just here to take Sora back. They were here to break her, to turn her into the mindless drone they expected human children to be. "Where is the livestock unit?" Vrex demanded, his plasma cannon powering up with an ominous whine. Before Jinwoo could answer, the ranch house door opened with a soft click. Sora stepped out onto the porch, no longer the frightened child from the auction block. She wore clean clothes and her hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, but what struck everyone silent was her posture. She stood straight and proud, her eyes clear and unafraid as she surveyed the assembled force. "I'm right here," she said simply. Rex's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. "Excellent. Unit 8847X, report for processing immediately." Sora didn't move. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, and Jinwoo realized with growing amazement that she was listening to something. Her eyes darted across the assembled soldiers, their weapons, their ships, taking in details that he couldn't even see. "Your plasma rifles are set to wide beam dispersal," she said conversationally. "Standard crowd control configuration. The power cells are at 93% charge, but the focusing crystals are slightly misaligned on units 4, 7, and 12, probably from atmospheric entry vibration." Vrex's scarred head snapped toward her. "How could you possibly know that?" "Your combat exoskeletons use Gravitech MK7 servo systems," Sora continued, as if she hadn't heard him. "The right rear actuator on your lieutenant's suit is running hot. You can hear it in the harmonic frequency. It'll fail in approximately 14 minutes under combat load." The Zephyrian soldiers shifted nervously, suddenly aware that this small human child was somehow reading their equipment like an open book. Vrex raised his plasma cannon, but Sora had already moved to the control panel mounted beside the ranch house door. "Your ships are using standard military defensive fields," she said, her finger hovering over a series of switches. "Excellent against projectile weapons and energy beams, but they're vulnerable to electromagnetic pulse in the 7.2 GHz range, especially when the generators are still in warm-up cycle." "Impossible," Vrex snarled. "No human child could know such things." Sora smiled, and for a moment she looked like nothing more than a happy 12-year-old girl. "You're right. No human child raised by your people could know these things, but I wasn't raised by you. I was raised by Uncle Jinwoo." She pressed the switches. The ranch's defensive grid had been installed years ago as protection against the native wildlife, but Jinwoo had never seen it used like this. Instead of the simple perimeter barriers he expected, the system activated in a complex pattern that sent carefully modulated electromagnetic pulses racing across the valley. The energy waves were invisible to human eyes, but their effects were immediately obvious. The Zephyrian ship's defensive shields flickered and died, their weapons systems shut down in cascading failures. Several of the soldiers' exoskeletons locked up completely, leaving their occupants trapped inside their own armor. Even Vrex's cybernetic implants sparked and went dark, his plasma cannon powering down with a dying whine. "Retreat," Vrex commanded, his natural voice a harsh screech without his translator collar. His soldiers stumbled back toward their ships, some dragging comrades whose suits had completely failed. The vessels lifted off in ragged formation, their engines coughing and misfiring as their systems tried to recover from the electromagnetic assault. As the enforcer ships disappeared into the orange sky, Jinwoo turned to stare at Sora in amazement. The 12-year-old girl who had just outmaneuvered an elite military force was calmly checking the ranch's systems, making sure the defensive grid hadn't overloaded itself. "How did you know all that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sora looked up from the control panel, her young face serious but not troubled. "I just saw the patterns, Uncle Jinwoo. When you're not afraid, when you know someone cares about you, you can see how things really work, instead of just how they're supposed to work." She paused, watching the last of the enforcer ships disappear beyond the horizon. "The aliens think we're weak because we're emotional, but emotions aren't weakness. They're what make us see possibilities that pure logic misses." That night, as they sat on the porch watching the alien constellations wheel overhead, Jinwoo finally understood what he had witnessed. Humanity's supposed weakness, their emotional nature and illogical behavior, wasn't a flaw to be corrected. It was their greatest strength, allowing them to see solutions and patterns that escaped even the most advanced alien minds. And if one small girl could do this, What might happen when others learned they didn't have to be afraid? The first to arrive was Lee Minho, a 15-year-old boy who appeared at Jinwoo's door 3 days after the enforcer incident. His clothes were torn and bloody, his face gaunt from hunger, but his eyes burned with desperate hope. He had escaped from the crystal mines of Proxima Station by crawling through ventilation shafts for 18 hours, following whispered rumors of a place where humans were treated like people instead of tools. "Is it true?" Minho asked, swaying on his feet from exhaustion. "Is there really a human who beat the consortium enforcers?" Sora emerged from the workshop, oil stains on her hands and a welding torch tucked behind her ear. When she saw the older boy's condition, she immediately guided him to the kitchen and began preparing food without a word. Minho stared at her in amazement, not because of what she was doing, but because she was doing it freely, without fear or permission. Within a week, Minho had transformed. The hollow-eyed slave who had stumbled to their door was gone, replaced by a young man whose mind worked like lightning. When Jinwoo showed him the ranch's mineral scanner, a device that had been giving inconsistent readings for months, Minho spent an hour studying its internal structure before completely redesigning its sensor array using spare parts from the scrap pile. "The aliens built this to find what they expect to find," he explained, as his modifications revealed previously hidden ore deposits throughout the valley. "But if you change the scanning frequency here and adjust the filtration matrix there, it can see things they never imagined existed." Yang Hana arrived 2 weeks later, carried unconscious in the cargo hold of a smuggler's ship. The 16-year-old girl had single-handedly sabotaged 3 consortium factory ships before their security forces finally cornered her on an asteroid mining platform. Her reputation in the underground networks was already legendary, but Jinwoo was shocked to discover that her most famous exploits had been acts of pure desperation rather than calculated rebellion. "I was just trying to stop the pain," she whispered as she recovered in the ranch house medical bay. "Every day watching the other children work to death, knowing I was next. So I started breaking things. Small things at first, then bigger ones. I never thought I could actually hurt them." But as Hana's physical wounds healed and her fear faded, her natural abilities emerged like flowers after rain. She possessed an intuitive understanding of complex systems that left even Sora impressed. When the ranch's main power grid began, fluctuating due to increased demand, Hana spent a single afternoon crawling through conduits before emerging with a solution that not only stabilized the system, but increased its efficiency by 40%. Park Dong-yun was different from the others. The 13-year-old arrived at the ranch in the dead of night, having walked for 6 days across the desert after escaping from a consortium research facility. His hands were scarred from years of forced labor, but they moved with an almost supernatural precision when he touched broken machinery. "They called me defective," he said quietly, as he examined Jinwoo's oldest atmospheric recycler, a unit that had been beyond repair for over a year. "Said I couldn't follow simple instructions, couldn't work in teams. But the machines talked to me. I could feel what was wrong with them." As if to prove his point, Dong-yun placed his palms flat against the recycler's housing and closed his eyes. For several minutes he stood motionless, his breathing deep and steady. Then his hands began to move, following pathways invisible to everyone else, until he found and pressed a single hidden reset switch that no one else had known existed. The ancient machine hummed to life with a sound like contentment. News of the ranch spread through the hidden networks like wildfire. Coded messages passed between slave compounds, whispered conversations in maintenance tunnels, and desperate transmissions from dying resistance cells all carried the same impossible story. Humans could be more than slaves, they could be extraordinary. The response from the consortium was swift and brutal. Their board of directors, a collection of the galaxy's most powerful alien species, held an emergency session in their massive space station headquarters orbiting the sector capital. The proceedings were broadcast live to every consortium world, a clear demonstration of their absolute authority. The infestation on Kepler 442b represents a Category 5 threat to galactic stability, announced Director Zexthul, a massive cephalopod whose tentacles writhed with barely contained rage. These aberrant humans are displaying capabilities that violate all established biological parameters. They must be eliminated immediately. The first wave of attacks came from the Vorthan Empire, reptilian slavers who specialized in problem livestock elimination. Their ships descended on the ranch like a plague of metal locusts, their crews expecting to find frightened children hiding in barns and storage sheds. Instead, they found themselves facing a coordinated defense that shouldn't have been possible. Zora had taught the other children to work together, to see the connections between different systems and exploit weaknesses that individual aliens would never notice. Minho's modified sensors detected the approaching fleet hours before they arrived. Hana sabotaged their landing systems using improvised electromagnetic mines. Dongyun somehow convinced the ranch's agricultural robots to reconfigure themselves into defensive positions. The Vorthan attack failed spectacularly, their ships forced to retreat with heavy damage and wounded pride. The second wave came from the crystalline hegemony, silicon-based beings who approached warfare like a mathematical equation. They brought overwhelming firepower and tactical precision, confident that brute force would succeed where subtlety had failed. But the children had learned something that their attackers couldn't understand. Every challenge made them stronger. Every threat forced them to discover new capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. When the hegemony's ground forces landed, expecting to face primitive human defenders, they instead encountered innovations that turned their own weapons against them. Sora's theories were proving themselves with each failed attack. Humans weren't just adaptable in the way other species understood adaptation. They were evolutionary catalysts, beings whose greatest strengths emerged precisely when they faced their greatest challenges. Fear and cruelty suppressed these abilities, but dignity and hope unleashed them in ways that terrified their former masters. As Jinwoo watched his adopted children coordinate the defense of their home, he realized that something historic was happening. This wasn't just about one ranch or even one planet. This was the beginning of humanity's true awakening, the moment when they discovered what they were really capable of, when they were no longer afraid. The galaxy would never be the same. The morning sun cast long shadows across Liberation Square as thousands of beings gathered for what historians would later call the moment everything changed. 2 years had transformed not just Kepler 442b, but dozens of worlds across the sector. What had started as whispered rumors about a miracle ranch had grown into something that shook the foundations of galactic civilization. New Seoul sprawled across the valley where Jinwoo's small ranch had once stood alone. The city rose in graceful spirals of living metal and crystal, its architecture a fusion of human creativity and alien technology that created something entirely new. Towers twisted skyward like growing trees, their surfaces covered in gardens that cleaned the air while producing food. Transportation tubes wove between buildings like silver rivers, carrying citizens on cushions of controlled gravity. But the most remarkable thing about New Seoul wasn't its beauty, it was its freedom. Human children played in parks alongside young Zephyrians whose parents had abandoned the consortium. Former slave masters worked side by side with their former property, building a society based on cooperation rather than domination. In the harbor, ships from a dozen species brought refugees and supplies, their crews eager to join the growing alliance of free worlds. At the center of it all stood Liberation Square, where a massive holographic display showed real-time updates from across the galaxy. Green dots marked liberated worlds, yellow showed planets in transition, and the shrinking patches of red revealed the consortium's collapsing empire. The old order was dying, not through warfare, but through the simple realization that cooperation produced better results than slavery. Sora Kim stood on the platform overlooking the square, no longer the frightened 12-year-old from the auction block. At 14, she had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a human leader whose authority came not from force or wealth, but from the radical idea that all intelligent beings deserved dignity. Her hair was longer now, streaked with premature silver from the stress of leading a revolution, but her eyes still held the same unbreakable spirit that had first caught Jinwoo's attention. Behind her stood the Council of Liberation representatives from every species that had joined the growing alliance. Lee Minho, now a master engineer whose innovations had revolutionized space travel. Yang Hana, whose understanding of complex systems had helped coordinate the peaceful transitions on 17 worlds. Park Dong-hyun, whose ability to communicate with any technology had made him the galaxy's most sought-after mediator between biological and artificial intelligence. But it wasn't just humans on the platform. Vrex the Ripper stood beside Sora, the former Enforcer's scarred exoskeleton, now bearing the insignia of the Liberation Defense Force. The same being who had once come to drag her back to slavery now served as her most trusted military advisor. His intimate knowledge of consortium tactics invaluable in protecting the growing alliance. "My friends," Sora began, her voice amplified by speakers that carried her words to every corner of the square and broadcast them across the sector. 2 years ago, most of you had never heard of humans except as a conquered species suitable only for manual labor. Today we stand together as equals in the greatest transformation our galaxy has ever seen. The crowd stirred, a mix of humans and aliens united by something more powerful than species loyalty. The shared experience of dignity restored and potential unleashed. Former consortium soldiers stood beside the children they had once oppressed. Corporate executives who had abandoned their old lives worked next to the miners they had once exploited. "They called us weak," Sora continued, her young voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "They were wrong. We are not weak, we are flexible. We are not broken, we are adaptive. And we are not livestock. We are the future." In the crowd, Park Jin-woo wiped tears from his weathered face. The struggling rancher who had once counted his last credits at a slave auction now watched his adopted daughter address the leaders of worlds. Around him, other former slaves held their own children, human and alien alike, all of them free to dream of futures their parents could never have imagined. The transformation hadn't been without pain. The consortium's final desperate attacks had cost thousands of lives, and the economic disruption of abandoning slavery had created hardships across dozens of worlds. But something remarkable had happened in the face of these challenges. Instead of breaking, the alliance had grown stronger. Every crisis had revealed new innovations, new ways of working together that produced results no single species could achieve alone. "The old galaxy was built on fear," Sora said, her words echoing off the crystalline buildings surrounding the square. "Fear that resources were scarce, fear that cooperation was weakness, fear that different meant dangerous. But we have learned something that our former masters never understood. Diversity is not a problem to be managed. It is a strength to be celebrated." As if to demonstrate her point, the massive display behind her showed images from across the liberated worlds. On Titan Prime, human engineers worked with crystalline mathematicians to design fusion reactors that produced clean energy at unprecedented efficiency. On the ocean world of Aquatica, former consortium administrators helped coordinate the rescue of species driven to the brink of extinction by industrial pollution. Even on distant Mechanis, artificial intelligences that had been enslaved as simple computers were discovering consciousness and creativity under human guidance. The consortium's response to these changes had been predictable, escalating violence and increasingly desperate propaganda about the dangers of human influence. But with each failed attack, more alien worlds began to question the old order. Why fight to maintain a system that required constant brutality when cooperation produced such obvious benefits? 3 months ago, the tipping point had finally arrived. The consortium's own board of directors had split, with over half the member species formally withdrawing their support. The Galactic Trade Commission, once the consortium's primary enforcement arm, had voted to recognize the Liberation Alliance as a legitimate government. Even the Imperial Navy, backbone of the old system's military power, had seen entire fleets defect rather than continue fighting against their own family members who had joined the free worlds. "Today marks not an ending, but a beginning," Sora announced as her speech reached its climax. "Today we establish the Galactic Cooperation Council, where every species has a voice and every being has rights that cannot be bought or sold. Today we choose a future built on hope instead of fear." The crowd erupted in cheers that echoed across the city and beyond. Ship horns blared in the harbor, their crews celebrating the birth of something unprecedented in galactic history, a government based on consent rather than conquest. As the formal ceremonies began, Jinwoo found himself thinking about that day 2 years ago when he had stood at the slave auction with his last few credits. He had thought he was buying a worker to save his failing ranch. Instead, he had bought a child and treated her like family. That simple act of compassion had grown into something that transformed the galaxy. The old consortium empire hadn't fallen to superior firepower or economic warfare. It had crumbled because enough beings had finally realized that dignity and cooperation produced better results than fear and exploitation. And it had all begun with a struggling rancher who chose kindness over profit, who saw a frightened child and decided to offer her hope instead of more suffering. As the celebrations continued into the night with fireworks painting the sky in colors from a dozen worlds, one truth became clear to everyone watching. The galaxy would never be the same. The age of slavery was over. The age of freedom had begun, the end.